When Nintendo exploded onto the home console scene in the 1980s, it brought with it so many franchises that would go on to become household names. Mario, Zelda, Metroid, Donkey Kong, in just a few short years, so many icons of the future were created. However, not every game from that era hit the big time straight away, and one that has remained on the periphery for a long time is Kid Icarus. Kid Icarus was originally developed as a sister title to Metroid, just as the even more obscure Mysterious Murasame Castle adapted Zelda elements into an original game to recycle core gameplay components and coding, so the Metroid team set to work creating the original Kid Icarus, utilizing elements from the original Metroid. The series managed a Game Boy sequel, but projects for the Super NES, Nintendo 64, and Wii never eventuated past really strong rumours. But finally, Kid Icarus Uprising launched on the 3DS in 2012, a game which reinvented the series under the watch of Masahiro Sakurai. Now we're in the era of Nintendo as an IP company, and while Kid Icarus is certainly a long way from being as iconic and as profitable as Mario, Zelda, or even Metroid, it is still a mascot IP with some name recognition that they own outright, and it's not as though they haven't shown ongoing interest in the franchise over the years. So, what exactly is the prognosis for more Kid Icarus in the short, medium, and long term? I think first of all we need to go back to the beginning. Nintendo embodies the Kyoto tradition of craftsmanship, of masters passing on their wisdom to their students, the core truth and the DNA of the series they create. Before we consider whether or not Kid Icarus can even be revived, we need to think about whether there is even a starting point for someone who can come and show younger developers how to understand it. Now, for any normal company, the chances of being able to revive a title 40 years after its inception would be slim indeed, but Nintendo has an exceptionally loyal staff, and so we need to talk about Toru Osawa. Toru Osawa is credited as the creator of Kid Icarus and is the person who shepherded its story and survived a frankly grueling production process on the original game, which involved months of crunch in a building where the heat was sometimes turned off during the middle of winter to save electricity. Reportedly, he designed the game, drew all the sprites, brought in Tose for testing, and shepherded the game almost to its completion, but it was unlikely to meet its December deadline until Yoshio Sakamoto, fresh from wrapping up Metroid, came over to support. Osawa went on to have critical roles in a number of games, notably shaping the iconic story of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and believe it or not, he is still working at Nintendo after all these years. He reviewed the scenario for Astral Chain and the Famicom Detective Club games, which brought him full circle as he was the writer of the original Famicom Detective Club tale, The Missing Heir. He also coordinates the occasional projects, such as Detective Pikachu Returns, and has received the occasional special thanks. His credits are relatively slim in recent years, but he has a wealth of experience as a director, producer, advisor, and supervisor. Born on the 27th of December 1962, he will be hitting the Japanese standard age of retirement at the end of 2027 when he turns 65. It's not impossible to imagine that, like many of Nintendo's senior people, he might decide to stick around that bit longer, especially for projects he finds intellectually stimulating and which stir his passions, and Kid Icarus might of course fit that bill. But would Nintendo really want to revive a franchise now? I think it's very likely that they would. Nintendo is a company that plans for the long term. In the 2010s, they started to find new development teams for some of their core franchises, and these developments led to some of the huge critical and sometimes also commercial successes of the Nintendo Switch era. Luigi's Mansion 3, Metroid Dread, the Grezzo Zeldas, and Metroid Prime being good examples of franchises which returned in the Switch era. In the Switch era, we've also seen bigger commitments as well for remakes of minor franchises which might have some enduring appeal. Famicom Detective Club, Another Code Resurrection, and I guess also the Donkey Kong Country series could fall into this category if they decide to take Donkey Kong in a different direction going forward. In this case, it feels less part of a coherent strategy and more responsive. With Bonanza booted to Switch 2 and Retro wrapped up with other things, a new Donkey Kong Country was impossible without a port, while Majors did the heavy lifting in pursuing the Famicom Detective Club remakes, and Nintendo still kept them waiting a year for their answer. Nevertheless, Famicom Detective Club proves that there is life in old franchises, and Nintendo is very much about making sure they get all the juice from the orange. These games are the products of huge amount of work and sweat and tears, and so I would expect that process to continue of finding value in past titles. But this situation doesn't really apply to Kid Icarus. Of the three Kid Icarus titles, only Uprising would suit a modern re-release, and that title is tricky because of that game's creator, the exceptionally busy and beloved Masahiro Sakurai. Even if they pulled Sakurai off Smash to work on a remake or even a sequel to such a niche title, this would be a necessary but not sufficient step to put Kid Icarus on a solid footing for the future. I just don't think Nintendo can or would wish to put the future of a potential Kid Icarus franchise on the shoulders of one genius creator who is mostly tied up with another series. Sakurai only happened upon Kid Icarus as the lead for Uprising relatively late in the game's development. As he explained on his own YouTube channel, Iwata had requested that he create a new 3DS title and suggested that he use one of the characters that Sakurai had become familiar with from the large roster of Nintendo characters that he had explored in recent Super Smash Bros. Titles. Sakurai decided on Kid Icarus, noting that there was demand for a new one, especially outside Japan, and he had already given Pit and friends a visual overhaul for Super Smash Bros. Brawl, so it made some kind of sense. But fundamentally, if Sakurai had decided to go in a different direction with his gameplay concept, it could easily have been a different character in the lead of that game. If Nintendo has designs on a relaunch, it can't be through Sakurai himself driving it. That brings us back to Toru Osawa, who continues to receive special thanks credits on Super Smash Bros., and it seems this is largely for his work in supervising the Kid Icarus segments, suggesting an ongoing interest in the franchise. Sakurai mentioned that he originally planned for someone else to write the story of Uprising, but ended up writing it himself for gameplay development reasons. It's plausible to me that Osawa might have had a deeper involvement with the story at an earlier point in the planning, given how he continues to advise on Emio and Astral Chain and clearly has an interest in story development. Osawa, it seems to me, is the only person who could credibly bring Kid Icarus back, but Nintendo literally cannot afford to wait. Even a commission now would mean a likely release well after his likely retirement age. The game needs to be underway as we speak, and possibly even nearing completion right now. It's far more stressful to do what Kenta Motakura had to do with Donkey Kong and bootstrap a team almost from scratch than to have the knowledge and experience of someone already immersed in the series at the heart of the development team. But if Osawa were dedicating significant time to Kid Icarus, we'd notice an unusual quiet in his credits, wouldn't we? Well, Osawa's track record in recent years is interesting. Until 2015, he received very regular credits on lots of games, albeit mostly smaller titles with some outside collaborators. However, in the Switch era, he's coordinated just the one game, Detective Pikachu Returns, where he was one of 3 names, suggesting to me that his role was pretty hands-off, potentially even covering maternity leave for another coordinator. Other than that, he has worked on scenario supervision for Astral Chain and the Famicom Detective Club titles, with his credit on Emio being for development support. None of these credits seem like full-time engagements. Now, a very senior figure like Osawa could easily be doing loads of things in Nintendo's vast rabbit warren of projects and subgroups. Perhaps he's focused on the theme parks or hardware development or future apps. But I could also absolutely see him as the director or producer of a Kid Icarus rejuvenation, and if there is a time to do it, now would be that time. If we assume that he was heavily involved with Astral Chain during 2017 and 2018, with the scenario presumably not requiring too much refining after that, he could have been approached to start thinking about booting Kid Icarus back up around 2019. This would be after Super Smash Bros. Ultimate had taken over the Nintendo world, putting Kid Icarus characters back into the public eye in a bigger way than ever before, and certainly after Nintendo knew that the Switch was a big success and that their future lay in IP expansion. It would have been around the time that Donkey Kong was requested for the Nintendo Switch by Yoshiaki Koizumi. It's also after Shuntaro Furukawa got his feet under the table, having apparently gone away to develop a very comprehensive strategy, while Tatsumi Kimishima ran the company in the immediate aftermath of Satoru Iwata's passing. I'm not saying bullet point one of his master plan was Kid Icarus, but of the dormant or near dormant franchises Nintendo has, only Star Fox and Donkey Kong have more obvious franchise potential, and unlike those two, its passionate creator was still in the building. If a small core team played around with developing the fundamental mechanics of what a new Kid Icarus game would look like in 2019 and 2020, they might have been ready to go into production some years ago. In other words, I'm not just saying that Nintendo might one day think about more Kid Icarus. I'm saying that if they want to do it at all, their window to deliver one under Osawa's tutelage is rapidly closing, and so I think we have to consider it a distinct possibility that such a project currently exists at Nintendo. Whether it eventuates to anything, given how difficult it was to get Kid Icarus off the ground on previous consoles, is another matter entirely. Perhaps we'll have to make do with Kid Icarus 99 or some other compromised version, but really Nintendo's preferred approach is to track back to the source to find a dedicated development team that fits. Most of the people who worked on the original game, and presumably most of those who worked on the Game Boy sequel, which doesn't have credits, are no longer available to work on it, and so this puts the onus very much on Toru Osawa to find another team. Now we have two models for how these kinds of rejuvenations go. Model 1 is Samus Returns and Famicom Detective Club, which is a hungry external team working in a similar genre, approaching Nintendo and pitching something using one of their core franchises. I think it's hugely unlikely that anybody has done this with Kid Icarus. It's too obscure, and there is no particular recent model of how a new Kid Icarus game would look in the 2020s. Model 2 is Donkey Kong Bonanza, and most likely Princess Peach Showtime, where Nintendo has a character that they want to do something with, and then find a good team to match and try to develop a project that fits. The problem is, while you can see the logic of doing this with Donkey Kong and Peach, both of whom are huge characters where there is clear commercial imperative, it's a little trickier to see Kid Icarus being quite such a priority. Or it would be, except for Osawa's age. As frustrating as it is to think that Nintendo were lackadaisical in their response back in the mid-2010s when Mages likely made their first approach to Nintendo about Famicom Detective Club, it's actually understandable when you consider where the company was at that time. The Wii U was sinking fast, the 3DS was doing well, but not as outlandishly well as its predecessor. It was before Pokemon Go, before really any of the broader IP expansion activities. You can imagine poor President Kimishima-san receiving a knock on the door and someone saying, "Mr. President, a company is interested in rejuvenating an obscure text-based game from the mid-80s. It's not exactly the Hail Mary he might have been looking for at that stage. But things are very different now, and Nintendo has managed to prove that partnering the right developers with the right franchises can be hugely successful. Do I think they recognize this and wish to recreate this with Kid Icarus? Absolutely, I do. But what should a Kid Icarus in the vein of the first two titles be? Uprising aside, nobody has done a side-scrolling Kid Icarus since 1991. Ultimately, while it wouldn't be quite the leap into a new genre that Bonanza was, a new side-scroller would still require a vast amount of updating. Assuming that Osawa was down to develop it, who would he work with? In this case, I think the field is quite open. The Game Boy title was apparently co-developed with the debuggers of the first game, Toze, a regular support studio who sometimes don't even take credits on their games. They contributed to Famicom Detective Club and a number of Paper Mario and WarioWare games in recent times, plus they supported on Animal Crossing New Horizons and Splatoon 2. They are an interesting studio who don't always take credit, but while they worked on both Kid Icarus titles then, I don't think this necessarily makes them an ideal developer all these years later. And besides, if there were a title they'd want to revive, it would surely be Starfy, a title they actually co-own with Nintendo. Another option that sounds bizarre but also could work could be Mercury Steam. In 2021, they released Metroid Dread, which reportedly had been on the slate for quite some time. The natural assumption has always been that they would go straight into developing Metroid 6, just as they went straight into Dread after Samus Returns. But we are 4 years down the track already, and there is no sign of anything. The assumption has to be that Nintendo are focusing on Metroid Prime 4 and then may reveal a new Metroid sometime next year, but there is another possibility. 2D Metroid has already had the successful Dread in recent years, and there is another 2D game that would surely be a slam dunk to port to Switch 2, and that is Metroid Samus Returns. Released in the dog days of the 3DS, it never had the sales profile it deserved, but it was Mercury Steam's first Metroid, and bringing it to the Switch would be a fantastic way to give us another Metroid if the core Mercury Steam team were working on a different project for Nintendo. In other words, if they were working on a new side-scrolling Kid Icarus, something which would absolutely fit the kind of games that they have developed before, having been responsible for reviving both Castlevania and Metroid. While I'd be sad to see Metroid 6 pushed back, especially as this would almost certainly mean that Sakamoto would be moving on from it, the company would likely still be able to produce a fully original Metroid for later in the Switch 2's life, and the larger install base at that time may suit Metroid, which can after all be a more niche endeavour. Mercury Steam's 246 employees as of November 2024 is massively up on the 160 people who worked there in 2020 when they were deep into Metroid Dread development, and also they released the online free-to-play game Space Lords for Windows, PlayStation and Xbox. They released the more substantial independent project Blades of Fire to mixed reviews in 2025, but traditionally their independent projects have synced quite tightly in terms of timings with their Nintendo work. It seems completely plausible to me that Mercury Steam could have an original Kid Icarus side-scroller and a Switch 2 version of Samus Returns for 2026 or 2027. If you think about it, this is really the last opportunity Mercury Steam would have when they can guarantee that Toru Osawa could be involved. If Nintendo were to wait until after Metroid 6, Osawa would be in his last year or so of definite employment. Perhaps they trust that he will continue on, but they can't guarantee that, and so the clock really is ticking. I mean, it's surely 90% that Mercury Steam have another Nintendo project, given the success of their last ones and the fact that their independent ventures don't seem to be representing all 246 of their employees. I previously would have put it as very likely that this new project is another Metroid, but with Sakamoto nearing retirement age himself, in fact he's over 65 already, and very likely to be leaving, given that he explicitly talked about having an heir in the Emio the Smiling Man interviews, perhaps Metroid Dread was in fact Sakamoto's swan song, in which case a fallow period for the Metroid franchise, as Nintendo make absolutely sure they know where they're going next with it, might be appropriate. I would now say that 50% the next Mercury Steam game will be a new Metroid, but I think it could be as high as 30% that Mercury Steam are on Kid Icarus. It just makes a huge amount of sense to me, especially for franchises like Metroid and Kid Icarus, which are, quite frankly, not sufficiently strong sellers to justify two similar titles within a single console generation. I love Metroid dearly, but if Nintendo were comfortable with only one original Super Mario Bros. Game in the whole Switch generation, why would they want to double dip on Metroid, as opposed to following the same pattern that they did with New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe and then Super Mario Bros. Wonder, but with Metroid? They could do Samus Returns and then do Metroid 6 towards the end of the console generation. This incidentally would sync up really well with my other speculation about the potential for a Wario Land revival, which is the topic of a separate video that I will link at the end, but it would be much easier to see Wario revived if there was not a current major new Metroid project alongside. Okay, so if Nintendo can get Kid Icarus back on the map with a new 2D title, resurrecting the series and perhaps inspiring a new generation to become interested in the Kid Icarus world, that provides some promising seed corn for future IP expansion efforts for Nintendo. What do successful franchises do? Why they have more games and in more different genres. And that is where we need to talk Kid Icarus Uprising. Nintendo is likely to want Sakurai to focus on Super Smash Bros. For the immediate future, but I think all is not completely lost for an Uprising return. A few years ago, Sakurai recorded a video on Kid Icarus Uprising, although because he batched his videos, it only released a couple of years ago. In that, he expressed regrets that he couldn't implement twin stick controls because the power of the 3DS did not support it, and as noted, it's a shame that it's only lived on 3DS, and I'd love to play it on a bigger screen with smoother graphics, but without a team around to work on it, crafting a follow-up seems difficult. Is this a tease for a Kid Icarus Uprising remake? Well, maybe. He also noted, another challenge was that the game was developed by a mixed team from various places who often wanted to do things in different ways that didn't really mesh. Even the obvious tasks couldn't get done, and people argued over the strangest things. In other words, if Kid Icarus Uprising were remade, he likely would not want to repeat the same mistakes, and this time would want full control over the process rather than letting it be redeveloped at arm's length. Would Nintendo really want a big name creator like Sakurai focused on a remake of a 3DS game in a niche series rather than Super Smash Bros. 6? Well, an arm's length remake just doesn't feel like a very Sakurai kind of thing, and I imagine that Sakurai would want that closer involvement to make sure everything is perfect, and may well decide he wants to create a new game anyway to reboot the whole thing from scratch. If Nintendo commissioned a Kid Icarus Uprising remake off the back of Kirby Air Riders, perhaps this would only take a short amount of Sakurai's time while he develops and experiments with concepts for a new Super Smash Bros., a process which potentially could take some time if the 6th Smash evolves the Smash concept quite a bit from Ultimate. In this case, I guess it feels plausible that we could see a Kid Icarus Uprising remake, perhaps for 2027 or 2028. And if you want the absolute dream scenario, I guess it could have been that the delay to starting Air Riders wasn't just Super Smash Bros. Ultimate DLC, but also specifying and getting on its feet a Switch 2 version of Kid Icarus Uprising. If this was being worked on in parallel with Kirby, then in theory we could see Kid Icarus back early next year. But I really don't see Sakurai as a two projects at once kind of guy, given the intense focus he lavishes on the games he produces, purely because his statements could be interpreted as a tease, and he does occasionally like to stir conversations about future projects. We can't rule out a current Kid Icarus Uprising project, but I think it's most likely that anything from Sakurai would have to wait until after he is done with the next Super Smash Bros., which would likely put it well into the next decade. Long term, though, this is obvious unfinished business for Masahiro Sakurai. I dare say there has been a conversation, at least in passing, about reviving Kid Icarus Uprising. If he can say about it on a YouTube video, he can say it to Shinya Takahashi. So in the very long term, I think it's near certain that we will see Kid Icarus Uprising back again. So if we put together what we've looked at in this video into a coherent plan, we can see a franchise roadmap for Kid Icarus starting to take shape. A new game from Mercury Steam from its creator, designed to put the franchise back on the map in a terrific way, perhaps launching around 2026. Then, Kid Icarus Uprising, remastered for the Switch 2 under the expert supervision of superstar director Masahiro Sakurai, coming in around 2031-2032. If you wanted to bootstrap a 4-decade-old franchise into the big leagues in a single generation, this is how you would do it. Huge sales could never be guaranteed, but they would have done everything they could reasonably do to ensure that their hardcore gaming audiences knew and loved Kid Icarus. And if a decade or two from now they have managed to crack film or television projects for Metroid, Splatoon, Donkey Kong, Pikmin and Kirby, they may feel like they need to look down the list at other options in their IP banks, and Kid Icarus could be extremely promising at this point. When I started researching this video, I really thought that Kid Icarus was a long shot for a revival. I no longer think this. I actually think it's probably odds on that Nintendo are at least trying internally to develop and bring back the series, and the only reason I'm not putting a percentage on this is that the development process of any game is intrinsically difficult, and sometimes things just don't come off, and that means that we may never know whether or not Kid Icarus was being attempted. but Nintendo will not put out a subpar game, as we've seen with the long delays on franchises like Pikmin, whereas they will keep going and going until they get it right. As it stands, I think it's a 30% chance that we will see something Kid Icarus before the end of 2027. I mentioned earlier that this theory actually goes some way to solving one issue I had with my Wario Land theory video, in that if there's no original Metroid in full development but rather Samus Returns is the current Metroid project, then this opens the field up considerably for a potential Wario title. You can see that video here. Huge thanks to Traveller of the Stars for the question. Thanks so much to the Patreon supporters. Please consider sharing this video so it reaches more people. But otherwise, I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.